My fellows of the Fae, it has been a long time coming, but finally I say to you, on this glorious day, we have finally found representation, as much as the dwarves, the elves, the halflings, and even those accursed tieflings. We are now there. We are now playable. Yes, we are now available to those gods that we claim and call players. Hello and welcome to this episode of Campaign Creator. Well, today we are looking at the very serious question of homebrewing and adding playable races. Now, your characters have already gone through session 0. Your players have already gone through session 0, and you kind of tested out your world a little bit. You've seen how things work, but perhaps you've realized, you know what, as a matter of fact, satyrs or centaurs or particular race that you've created all on your own, they actually could be pretty cool if they were a playable race. So where do you start? How do you even go through the process of making a playable race and then introducing it to your players? That's what we're looking at in today's video. Now, I'm turning to World Anvil for this because A, the show is sponsored by World Anvil, but B, because World Anvil has the template ready and waiting for you. So here I are in World Anvil, as you can see, all of their different templates and things. But if we scroll down to the bottom now, I have activated the module for my role-playing game of choice. In this case, it's Dungeons and Dragons. So how do we fit in a new race? Well, quite frankly, we click on the new race button. It's as easy as that. And then we can start to go through it. Now, already we can see a new layout from World Anvil. If you've been watching my videos in the past, you might be going, hang on, what's this? What's this going on here? What's all this stuff? Yes, this stuff is all new. This is a new layout since Heroes launched on World Anvil recently. So now we can start to go through and build through this character sheet. All right, now it's very simple. When you're starting to create a race, coming up with a name. I mean, that is usually you're going to be drawing from an existing character class, or I should say an existing race that's within your world or that you're wanting to add in. If it is a completely new race, we're going to have to develop more than just a few descriptors here and there. Generally speaking, though, whatever gaming system you're using, they will have, maybe not always, but they will have a space where they can talk, where they talk about what you should think about when adding in a new playable race. If they don't have, then what you need to do is you need to go back to the mechanics and look at the human. The human is usually a stock standard in almost all role-playing games. I can think of a few. Mice and Mystics, I think, is one of them. Mouse Guard doesn't have humans as a playable race, but generally speaking, find the base race, the core race around which all other races are based, and then you can start to look at, okay, this is what the baseline is. They've got 4 attributes, they've got 3 of these, they've got 2 of those, they've got 1 of these, and they've got 1 of those. Then you can start to work it out. Now, again, what I like about World Anvil is that they have done that for you in terms of certain features for certain role-playing systems. So let's go back, let's carry on filling in this form. When we go back here, we're going to just very quickly type in Satyr as our playable race. Now, the Satyrs have got a bit of a bad rap. Historically, they've always been seen as devious, mischievous, half-goat type men. Greek mythology certainly is where they come from, and they were doing all kinds of interesting things there. And when it comes to ability scores, now this is very sort of D&D centric, but generally speaking, again, your race will have certain statistics. Whatever type of game you're playing, there's certain types of statistics that they will have or that they may have. This is where you now start to need to apply things. And the question that you need to ask yourself at this point, yes, we want to add in satyrs. Is there an equivalent race that has already been generated by official material? Now, why is that important? Why is official material something that we need to look at? Well, official material is what the players are going to be looking at. They're going to be basing their ideas and their thoughts around what is available officially and that I can make use of, then they're going to look at, okay, well, what's available in your campaign? So there's no point in creating a race that's so overpowered that every player is going to say, well, I want to play that race, not because I'm interested in the race, not because I'm interested in the narrative that comes with playing that race, but because that race is super powerful and I want those powers for myself. So we don't want that. We want to create a race that is balanced in terms of the setting. Now, a lot of people might push back and say, well, actually, this race is super powerful. They're demigods. They've really got superpowers. They really should be more powerful. Well, sure. Then you've got to look at more traditional means. Now, in the past, games were very asymmetrical. So the role-playing games were a lot more asymmetrical. That means that there were a lot more things that were in imbalance, but which required the players to kind of balance it themselves, or to simply accept that, well, actually, they are imbalanced, and you only play them because you play them for a narrative reason, not for a numbers reason. I think that also is a little bit of whimsy in terms of how fair players were back in the day. So sometimes there were penalties imposed upon the race. So yes, this race has godlike powers, but they can't leave their territory, they can't leave their homeworld, they can't leave their space. It's those kinds of things. Or there was a super powerful watchdog, even more powerful than they were, that prevented them from intervening and from using their powers. So there are all kinds of things that you can build in to bring in balance. And that's something that you're going to have to really, really focus on. Is you want balance. You want, when you present the race to your players, you want your players to go, oh, that's so cool, I like it, it's balanced, I could play a human, or I could play a dwarf, or I could play, in this case, a satyr, and not have a problem. So that's something that you need to look at. The other question that you really need to ask yourself on a fundamental level is, how is this race going to integrate into my world, and how is it going to help me as the game master to tell a better story? The whole idea... Wait, just give me a second. Oh, that's so much cooler. It's so hot in Japan now that it's in summer. And, oh, that's even better. That's even better. Now I can breathe and think properly. My head was just all this hair, and there's a reason why I shave it. Anyway, so the idea is, why does this race need to be playable? Why does it need to be added? What is it going to add to your story if you have a player who's playing a satyr? Well, again, you need to step back and say, how do they fit into my campaign world? How does this race integrate into my campaign world? What does it bring? What does the race bring in terms of narrative options for me as the game master? Aha, well, if I have one player who's playing, in this case, a satyr, well, then that's great. I can explore the satyr relationships, because when we look at our world map of Aetherios, of Gaia anyway, the whole world in which the kingdom of Aetherios is based, or the hegemony, I should say, we then can start to say, okay, cool, well, this is what we can see, this is what's coming up, this is the political dynamic that's going to be happening, this is the racial tension that's going to be happening. The satyrs, maybe they have little colonies, maybe they're a slave race. You need to really unpack, where does this race fit within the greater ecosystem of your world? Now, before we continue too much further, when we start talking about the ecosystems, however you want to pronounce it, when we start talking about that, we start to then look at things like, okay, if they are a powerful race, why don't they have their own kingdom? Why have they not claimed their own kingdom? If they are a subservient race, that's fine, but what do they as a race feel about that? Is there a dissenting rebellion group that's growing, trying to overthrow the dominating dwarves or elves? What is the general perception of them in a public space where they are they're just going about their business? When they walk into town, are they going to be treated like slaves? Are they going to be treated indifferently? Are they going to be treated with respect? Maybe they're seen with reverence, these venerable creatures of the Feywild. Where do they fit within the social strata within your campaign world? And how is that going to affect the players? Because if the players choose to play, in this case, let's just say they're playing a satyr, and you decide that the satyrs are a slave race. The player now is faced with the dilemma. Either they're going to be playing a slave to one of the other player characters, that would facilitate group play and the like, or they're going to have a freeman certificate or a tattoo saying that they're now free to roam the kingdoms. Otherwise, they're going to be faced with a whole lot of issues. They're being chased because they escaped from their slave community or the farm that they were assigned to, or the owner is looking for them. There are a whole lot of things that come in which players might enjoy. Not every player might enjoy that, though. So if you're creating a blanket race and you are creating these very specific conditions, it can lead to problems. It can lead to very interesting stories, too. On the other hand, if they're seen as revered interpreters of the Feywild, well, that also puts pressure on the player to then play a character who has some kind of mystical power, whether it's the ability to call on Cthulhu or to guide starships with their minds, or in the case of Satyrs, to be able to lure people to Bacchanalian festivals. It depends on what you want, but the idea is, whatever you give this race, you need to make sure that there is a common version as well. So yes, all Satyrs are seen as these mystical guides to the Feywild. Well, not all Satyrs necessarily want to be mystical guides. Some just want to be farmers or potters or artists or adventurers who have nothing to do with it. So how do they operate? What do they do? Where do they go from? Those are the kinds of questions you need to ask yourself when creating the race. So let's go back to that character sheet now that we've unpacked that fully. When we talk about Satyrs, okay, Satyrs, ability scores, let's see. They've got cloven hooves, which have that funny walk to them. Now, we've seen Satyrs in various films and things from way back when, and they always have this weird kind of walk to them. Hooves are not the most stable things, and I've seen horses and cows. Yes, those are the two hoofed animals that I have seen. When they're walking over cobblestones or very smooth concrete, or wet concrete for that matter, they slip just as much as the rest of us. So there's a stability issue there. Does that make them particularly dexterous? I don't think so. What about strength? Are they particularly strong? Well, their upper torsos are generally shown as being fairly muscular. Their lower limbs are that of a goat. So I would say, okay, let's give them a little bit of strength. Goats are a remarkably strong creature, generally speaking. Again, this is just drawing from my own personal experience. Then, are they particularly healthy? Well, goats will eat anything. They really will eat anything. There is very little that they won't eat. They're particularly hardy types of creatures, so maybe constitution. The human half, or the fey half, well, generally elves are seen as not having a very high constitution at all. So we've ruled out dexterity, we've kind of ruled out constitution, we've got strength. Okay, great. Let's look then at intelligence. Are they particularly smart? Do they have a particularly efficient education system? Again, this goes back to your world setting. If Satyrs are a slave race, education is going to be the least of their worries, which means that they're not going to be very well educated. That doesn't mean that they're not going to be intelligent, but generally speaking, education and intelligence go hand in hand. You don't know what you don't know, and if you've had some education, at least you don't know how much you don't know. Whereas if you haven't had an education, the entire world is a wonder. So maybe not intelligence. On the other hand, we then get to wisdom. Wisdom is definitely an attribute that they may have. Wisdom represents knowledge of nature and surviving out in the wild. If you look at the creatures in the Monsters Manual, most animals, most beasts have got quite a high wisdom, relatively speaking, in comparison to, say, their intelligence. So it could be that. So we've got strength potential, we've got wisdom potential, and then there's charisma. Now, charisma traditionally for Satyrs is, on a Greek scale, fairly high. We don't often hear of stories of Satyrs failing to get people to attend these drunken orgies and the like, and they are known for wooing strangers to their deaths in the woods and so on. So perhaps charisma is something that we can look at. Traditionally, the way that Dungeons and Dragons assigns its skill points is it gives a +2 to something and a +1 to something else. There's a mechanical reason for that. A +1, generally speaking, isn't going to affect your character too much at the first level. Once they get to level 4 and they get that first ability increase, now that +1 is going to actually translate into a +1 modifier bonus rather than just to a standard +1. Then we take it and we look at it and we say, well, +2 +1, I'd rather go +1 +1 +1. This has been done before. It's not uncommon. Humans get +1 to everything and then very little else. So in order for satyrs to have a certain amount of personality as a racial species, I would say let's give them +1. Let's do it very quickly. So we're going to click here and we're going to go +1. And you can see I've been doing races all morning. +1 to strength. +1 to did we say constitution? No, we didn't. We said wisdom. And +1 to charisma. Okay, so that gives us a rather interesting species. Now we start looking at whether they are small, medium, large, or tiny. Small, medium, large, tiny. In some games, it has no value whatsoever. It doesn't matter whether the creature is 3 foot tall or 6 foot tall, there's no mechanical bonuses. In Dungeons and Dragons, there are benefits and penalties for size. More importantly, though, the idea of size, I've only ever seen it presented twice before in Hollywood sense anyway, where we get a real visceral sense of size being taken into account in a fantasy world. When you watch the films of Willow, as well as The Lord of the Rings, we start to get a sense that, yes, there are special spaces that have been made specifically for shorter races. Now, that might not be something that you necessarily factor into your games at all, that a 3-foot character can't interact with a bench that's traditionally 4.5 to 5 foot high. They just can't get that. They can get their fingertips on top of it, and that's about it. So scale isn't just a function of mathematics and mechanics in your game. It should also be a function of design, aesthetic, as well as, quite frankly, when the characters walk into the bar, there could be a section that's much, much lower, designed for smaller races, and that's got a smaller barkeep, so there's no bending down, looming over one's customers. You want to make your customers feel as comfortable as possible. You also realize as a barkeep that if you have a tavern that's designed for humans and you have halflings attending your tavern, you can fit twice as many halflings in as you can humans. Well, it's probably more like 1.5, but nonetheless, your beds don't have to be as big, your mattresses don't have to be as thick, you don't have to have as much floor space dedicated to each individual. A large room is really just a standard-sized human room. All of those things start to come into play, or at least should come into play, if you want your race to feel as if it is part of a working world that is taking as much advantage of them as it possibly can. And let's be honest, that's what worlds do. That's what we do. Oh, there's a gap in the market. I'm going to take it. It's a small gap, har har, but I'm going to claim it anyway. That's something else to think about. What is the racial tendencies? Now, satyrs in my mind are 5 foot, which puts them at being medium in the Dungeons and Dragons space. Their speed, I could refer to the Monsters Manual in terms of the speed of a satyr. It's probably written down there somewhere. I'm going to say it's going to be 30 foot per round, because I can't see them traveling much faster than that. That's the standard speed for a human, and they do have their, I would say on open ground, they're probably the same. Languages, we're going to give them common, and then we're going to give them Fey, because they come from the Fey Wild. Now, when it comes to features is where it starts to become really complicated in terms of balance. Generally speaking, the way that Dungeons and Dragons works, for example, is that there are 3 things that the race will have. They will have some kind of saving throw benefit. They will have some kind of racially specific ability, and then they will have occasionally 1 or 2 more very specific use abilities, which they may or may not take into account, or they will have skills that they are proficient in. So it just depends entirely on you as to which route you want to take. And there is no hard and fast rule. However, I would encourage you that when it comes to features, the important thing for you to remember is, why did you make this race in the first place? If it's because you wanted your players to be able to play Satyrs, what is it that Satyrs bring to the world that your other races don't? And I think that that is something that's very important. Now, we could give them some magical abilities. They could have something like the Charm Person spell. That's very powerful. So if they can cast that once a day, that might work. Again, though, that is starting to tread onto the territory of the wizards and the other spellcasters. So if that's their only power, then that's okay. It could maybe level up, or what they have done in the past is that they simply assign a higher level spell. Now, again, rule of thumb in Dungeons & Dragons, they don't ever assign a spell higher than level 3. So in other words, by the time you reach level 5, your character unlocks the final racial spell that they can cast, and that's usually one level 3 spell. And there's often a limitation on how many times they can cast it. Usually it's once per day or once per long rest. So those are the things that we can add in. I'm not going to add them in here particularly, but I am going to look very quickly at what Satyrs possess from an overall perspective. And that, to me, is that whole ability to be able to charm their way, to inspire others, to give them some kind of bonus or boost. Now, what I'm going to say is, I am going to say it is the charm of the satyr. Satyr. The charm of the satyr. And what this does is, once per long rest, let's capitalize that so we know exactly what's going on. Once per long rest, the satyr can temporarily increase their charisma ability by +2, I would say, because that's going to affect a whole range of skills and things, by +2 for a specific race and gender. By +2 for the purposes of dealing with a specific race and gender. This increase lasts for 1d4 hours, because that's how long an orgy usually lasts for. This increase lasts for 1d4 hours, after which the Satyrs charisma score returns to normal. All right, so there we go. So they can increase their charisma ability by +2. That is going to affect all of their skills that are applied to it. I restricted it to a specific race and a specific gender because, again, I feel that that is kind of how the Satyrs worked. It was, well, we're going to go and pull in a bunch of Vestal virgins to sacrifice at Delphi. We're going to go and do this. We're going to do that. So I think that's how a satyr would work, and I think that it takes an action to activate this power. So they're going to have to focus and concentrate and kind of draw on their inner fayness, their inner raw magnetic attraction, I suppose you could call it, and then try and do this. Now, what I like about this ability is that this also works for satyr who don't want to be handsome or beautiful. It works for satyrs who want to be intimidatory, and those horns, those goat-like horns that they have, all those kinds of things, can certainly then be used in that, because when you look at what skills are attached with charisma, there is a benefit to having a +2 to your ability score. So it pumps it up by a measly +1 in order of your check. That's a 5% increase across the board, which is not bad, but when you look at the number of skills that it affects, and for 1d4 hours, that certainly can translate into some very useful negotiation things happening there and the like. I think it's also quite indicative of the race. I am also going to give them an immunity. Immune. The satyr is immune to the effects of alcohol. You can't run a bacchanalian orgy if you are simply getting drunk all the time. It doesn't work. So I'm going to include that. It's a very specific power, and it's one that doesn't come up very often within the role-playing environment. How often have your characters been drunk and your GM has actually assigned some kind of penalty to that? So this is a very minor, flavorsome type of ability. I'm then going to give them some skills. So let's say you gain proficiency in, let's say, survival and persuasion. I think that makes the most sense, to be perfectly honest with you. And there we have it. We have our satyr. Now, there are many more things to this template that we can start to add. You can see all of the different races that I've been creating over time. There are so many of them. If I go back here, we can add in, if they've got specific equipment, creatures and mounts, retinues. We can go through the whole thing and really add in whatever we like. And of course, we can add in an image to really sort of just drive home what these creatures look like. So when creating your own race, this is, I think, very important. When creating your own race, it's about realizing how do they survive in your world, how do they integrate into your world, and what are they going to bring to your world. Is every king now going to have a satyr as their diplomat? I don't see why not, but then you might want more representation, so a satyr might very well be on that delegation. That's if they're on equal terms. If they're on an equal footing, those kinds of racial puns, again, you can build that in. Is there racial animosity between the races? Is there this sort of sense that, oh, the satyrs are evil and that they represent the powers of evil as they do here in the real world? What are the connotations? Those are all of the kind of interesting questions that you need to be asking yourself when creating your race. And I think that that is a space that you can explore freely within your own world. Now, we also need to then compare this with other races and throw it out to our players. Now, Great GM will be doing a video in the next couple of weeks where we actually look at the questions you should be asking when designing your own home-brewed kind of rules and things, and a race falls into that space. So watch out for that video if you want to know more about the nitty-gritty of designing homebrew material rather than just a race. What races have you come up with? Share them down below. I know for my Ghosts of Saltmarsh game, I had to create merfolk because there wasn't an existing template that I could find for merfolk. The Sharkan, the shark folk, are a very unique, specific race to the setting. The Seabolds, the aquatic kobolds, also we made up for that. And then the aquatic elves. The aquatic elves existed in other editions of Dungeons & Dragons, but they don't exist in 5th edition. So we had to create statistics for them as well, and we created some cool statistics based on the backstory within the world setting, not in the general milieu of Dungeons and Dragons. So you can go and look out for Ghosts of Saltmarsh every Saturday on twitch.tv/DND, or replayed on this channel a week or so later. Until then, I wish you and yours the greatest of racial creation, and all I have to say is, light up the forge. Must I really put these back on? It's so hot. And I mean, I like the horns, and I really subscribe to the idea of this author's wig, but can't I just bang my head against a bell and get alerted to the next video so we can move on to a costume change?